Most people think they know exactly how World War II began. German tanks crossed the Polish border on September 1st, 1939. Hitler ordered the invasion. Britain and France declared war, and the world descended into the deadliest conflict in human history. It also ignores events beyond Germany. Japan had already expanded into Manchuria. Italy had invaded Ethiopia. The League of Nations had repeatedly failed to stop aggression, proving that international law meant almost nothing without the power and willingness to enforce it. Neville Chamberlain returned to Britain believing he had prevented catastrophe. Many people celebrated because they remembered the trenches, mass graves, and ruined families of the previous war. Peace, even an imperfect peace, seemed worth almost any price. But the agreement transferred Czechoslovakia's defensive positions, industrial strength, and strategic territory to Germany. It weakened one of Hitler's most capable potential opponents, without requiring German forces to fight for the advantage. Within months, Hitler violated the logic of the agreement. German forces occupied the remaining Czech lands in March 1939, proving that his ambitions extended far beyond uniting German-speaking populations. That occupation shattered the belief that limited concessions could satisfy him. Britain and France finally recognized that Hitler was not simply revising unfair borders. He was destroying neighboring states and rebuilding Europe through coercion. Munich did not cause the war by itself, but it strengthened Germany, isolated smaller countries, and convinced Hitler that the Western democracies might retreat again when he turned his attention toward Poland. There was now far less room for compromise. Yet one final barrier still stood in Hitler's path. A war against Poland could draw Germany into conflict with the Soviet Union, unless Stalin decided that cooperation with the West was even more dangerous. The Soviet Union had watched the European crisis with growing suspicion. Stalin feared Nazi expansion, but he also distrusted Britain and France, believing they might direct Hitler eastward and leave the Soviet Union to face Germany alone. Moscow explored the possibility of a collective security agreement with the Western powers. In theory, Britain, France, Poland, and the Soviet Union could have formed a coalition strong enough to deter a German attack. In practice, the negotiations moved slowly and were poisoned by mutual distrust. British and French officials doubted Stalin's intentions. Stalin doubted their willingness to fight. Poland feared allowing Soviet troops to cross its territory, even in the name of defense. Those fears were not irrational. Polish leaders remembered earlier conflicts with Russia and worried that Soviet forces invited in during a crisis might never leave. But without transit rights, any military agreement with Moscow was difficult to make credible. The conventional version also treats the war in Asia as a separate story, even though Japanese expansion, European weakness, and American isolation were already reshaping the same global order that would later collapse into a worldwide conflict. Hitler recognized the opportunity. Germany and the Soviet Union were ideological enemies, but both governments saw short-term advantages in a temporary agreement. Hitler wanted to avoid fighting Britain, France, and the Soviet Union at the same time. Stalin wanted time to rebuild Soviet military strength, recover influence in Eastern Europe, and delay a direct confrontation with Germany. He also believed the Western powers had failed to create a serious alliance against Hitler. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. Publicly, the agreement promised that neither side would attack the other. Secretly, it divided much of Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland stood directly in the path of that arrangement. The pact removed Hitler's immediate fear of a two-front war and made an invasion far less risky. It also revealed how completely the post-war security system had collapsed. The agreement did not make Germany and the Soviet Union genuine allies. Their ideologies, ambitions, and strategic interests remained deeply hostile. It was a temporary bargain between two regimes preparing for different futures. But in the summer of 1939, temporary cooperation was enough. Hitler had neutralized the largest power to Germany's east, at least for the moment. Stalin had bought time, territory, and strategic space. The final obstacle was gone. Europe had spent 20 years building a system meant to prevent another world war. Now, through fear, mistrust, aggression, and failed diplomacy, that system had cleared the path to Poland. After the German-Soviet agreement was signed, Hitler intensified pressure on Poland. He demanded the return of Danzig, access across the Polish corridor, and political concessions that would have weakened Polish independence. Poland refused because its leaders believed each concession would invite another demand. They had watched what happened to Austria and Czechoslovakia. Accepting limited territorial changes no longer looked like diplomacy. It looked like the first stage of national destruction. Britain and France had now guaranteed Polish independence. Their leaders hoped the promise would deter Hitler, but Germany had already learned that previous warnings were often followed by hesitation and compromise. So the real question is not simply why Hitler wanted war. His ambitions were clear. The deeper question is why the international system gave him so many opportunities to test its limits, break its rules, and grow stronger after every violation. The Nazi regime also prepared a propaganda justification for war. German authorities staged incidents and claimed that Poland had attacked Germany. These operations were designed to present aggression as self-defense and confuse international opinion. On September 1st, 1939, German forces invaded Poland from the west, north, and south. Aircraft attacked military targets, cities, transportation networks, and communication centers, while armored units moved rapidly across the country. Britain and France demanded that Germany withdraw. When Hitler refused, both governments declared war on September 3rd. The European conflict had officially begun, though neither country could provide immediate relief to Poland. On September 17th, Soviet forces entered eastern Poland under the secret arrangements made with Germany. The Polish state was attacked from both directions and divided between two powerful neighbors. This was not the beginning of every cause behind World War II. By then, the League of Nations had failed, collective security had collapsed, Germany had expanded repeatedly, and the Western powers had run out of territory they were willing to surrender. Poland became the point where nearly 20 years of resentment, economic crisis, ideological extremism, failed deterrence, and aggressive calculation finally collided. The invasion did not create the war from nothing. It exposed how thoroughly the international system had already broken down. So who truly caused World War II? The clearest answer begins with responsibility. Hitler and the Nazi regime deliberately chose rearmament, territorial expansion, racial persecution, and war as instruments of national policy. Germany launched the invasion of Poland. Japan pursued military conquest in Asia. Italy invaded Ethiopia and expanded across the Mediterranean. The Soviet Union participated in the division of Poland after signing its agreement with Germany. Those actions matter because explanation must never become excuse. Economic hardship, national humiliation, and diplomatic failure help us understand how war became possible, but they do not erase the choices made by governments that initiated aggression. World War II was not created by one decision, one treaty, or one dictator acting alone. It emerged when deliberate aggression met economic collapse, political fear, diplomatic weakness, and a peace settlement that had never resolved the damage left by the previous war. At the same time, focusing only on Hitler leaves the deeper story incomplete. The post-war settlement created unresolved grievances. The Great Depression weakened democratic institutions. The League of Nations repeatedly failed to enforce its own principles. Britain and France delayed confrontation because they feared another slaughter. The United States remained largely detached from European security. Stalin distrusted the Western powers and made a temporary bargain with Hitler that reduced the immediate risks of invasion. None of these factors made war unavoidable. Different decisions could have slowed Germany, strengthened collective security, or created a more credible alliance before 1939. But each failure reduced the number of peaceful options still available. The war, therefore, had both direct causes and enabling conditions. Direct responsibility belongs to the regimes that chose invasion. The wider catastrophe became possible because economic collapse, political extremism, weak institutions, and failed deterrence reinforced one another. That distinction is essential. Understanding the conditions that produced war does not distribute guilt equally among every country. It explains why aggression succeeded long enough to become a global disaster. World War II was not caused by one treaty, one depression, or one dictator acting in isolation. It began when deliberate expansion met an international system too divided and too hesitant to stop it before the final crisis arrived. The deepest lesson of World War II is that global catastrophes rarely begin with a single dramatic event. They are usually built through years of smaller decisions, ignored warnings, weakened institutions, and compromises that appear manageable at the time. A treaty can end fighting without creating a stable peace. For peace to survive, the system must be viewed as legitimate, allow peaceful change, protect vulnerable states, and impose credible consequences when powerful countries violate its rules. The story also reveals the difference between diplomacy and surrender. Negotiation can prevent conflict when both sides accept limits. It becomes dangerous when one side treats every agreement as permission to prepare the next demand. Economic crises matter for the same reason. Poverty and unemployment do not automatically produce dictatorship, but they can destroy trust in democratic institutions and make simple promises, invented enemies, and extremist movements far more attractive. To understand how that unstable system was built, we have to return to 1919, when the victors of the First World War gathered in Paris and attempted to design a permanent peace. Institutions also cannot defend themselves. The League of Nations had principles, procedures, and international support on paper. What it lacked was the willingness of powerful members to accept real costs before aggression became impossible to contain. The final lesson is not that war was inevitable. It is that prevention becomes harder after every warning is ignored. Each delayed response reduces future choices until leaders are left deciding between a terrible confrontation and an even more dangerous retreat. World War II began in Poland, but its true origins were older and deeper. They were found in unresolved war, economic collapse, ideological ambition, failed cooperation, and the belief that tomorrow would somehow be easier than acting today. History does not repeat itself mechanically, but it does punish societies that confuse temporary calm with lasting peace. When the First World War ended in November 1918, Europe was exhausted, indebted, and politically unstable. Millions were dead. Entire regions had been shattered. 4 major empires had collapsed or begun to disappear, leaving behind new borders, new governments, and old hatreds that no conference could easily erase. In January 1919, leaders from the victorious powers gathered in Paris to design the post-war order. They claimed they were building a lasting peace. In reality, they were trying to satisfy goals that often contradicted one another. France wanted security above everything else. Its territory had been invaded twice within half a century, and much of northern France had been devastated. French leaders wanted Germany weakened so severely that it could never again threaten the French border. Britain wanted Germany punished, but not permanently destroyed. British officials feared that a collapsed Germany would damage European trade, upset the balance of power, and leave France or revolutionary Russia too dominant on the continent. President Woodrow Wilson arrived with a different vision. He promoted national self-determination, open diplomacy, and a League of Nations that would replace traditional power politics with collective security. It was ambitious, idealistic, and difficult to apply consistently. That sequence is historically correct, but it does not reveal the true origin of the war. By the time German forces entered Poland, the foundations of peace had already been dismantled, decision by decision, for nearly 20 years. The problem was that national self-determination sounded cleaner in speeches than it looked on a map. Ethnic groups were scattered across Central and Eastern Europe. Creating a homeland for one population often meant placing another population under a government it did not choose. New states such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia emerged from the ruins of defeated empires. But their borders included large minorities, disputed territories, and competing historical claims. Peace created new nations, yet it also created new grievances inside them. Germany was largely excluded from negotiating the final settlement. Its representatives were eventually presented with terms they were expected to accept. That humiliation became politically explosive, especially because many Germans still did not believe their army had been decisively defeated. The victors wanted a settlement strong enough to punish Germany, flexible enough to preserve stability, and fair enough to prevent future revenge. Those goals could not all be achieved at the same time. The peace conference did not make another world war inevitable, but it created a system filled with unresolved borders, conflicting promises, weak enforcement, and deep resentment. The next question was how harshly Germany would be treated and whether punishment could ever produce lasting peace. The Treaty of Versailles became the most controversial symbol of the post-war settlement. To many Germans, it was not a peace agreement negotiated between equals. It was a dictated punishment imposed by victorious powers, while Germany had almost no meaningful role in shaping the final terms. Germany lost territory in Europe, surrendered its overseas colonies, accepted severe military restrictions, and faced reparations for wartime damage. Its army was limited, conscription was banned, and major weapon systems were forbidden. The Rhineland was placed under strict controls, intended to protect France from another invasion. The treaty also included Article 231, later known as the War Guilt Clause. Its legal purpose was to establish responsibility for damages and justify reparations. But politically, many Germans interpreted it as a declaration that Germany alone had caused the entire war. That interpretation became a powerful source of anger. Nationalists claimed Germany had been humiliated, robbed, and falsely accused. Political movements used Versailles to explain economic hardship, territorial losses, military weakness, and nearly every frustration facing the new Weimar Republic. Yet the claim that Versailles automatically created Hitler is too simple. Germany experienced several years of relative political and economic stability during the mid-1920s. Diplomatic agreements eased tensions, foreign investment returned, and the Nazi Party remained a marginal force during much of that period. A punitive settlement after the First World War became a weapon for political revenge. A global economic collapse destroyed confidence in democracy. Japan and Italy discovered that international rules could be violated without facing a serious collective response. Versailles created resentment, but resentment alone does not explain dictatorship. Other defeated states also faced territorial losses and political upheaval without producing a movement identical to Nazism. Hitler did not merely inherit anger. He reshaped it into a racial, nationalist, and expansionist program. He presented the treaty as proof that Germany had been betrayed from within and surrounded by enemies abroad. He blamed democratic politicians, socialists, communists, and Jews for defeat and humiliation. These accusations were false, but they gave frightened and angry people a simple explanation for a complicated collapse. The treaty therefore mattered less as a direct cause than as a political weapon. It gave extremists a permanent symbol of national disgrace. Every economic crisis, diplomatic dispute, and social conflict could be connected back to the supposed betrayal of 1919. Versailles did not make another world war inevitable, but it left Germany with unresolved grievances, weakened democratic legitimacy, and a public vulnerable to leaders promising revenge. Hitler would later exploit every one of those weaknesses with ruthless precision. Germany's new democracy was born under conditions that would have tested a far stronger political system. The Weimar Republic inherited military defeat, revolutionary unrest, economic disruption, and a population deeply divided over what the country should become. Many Germans never accepted the legitimacy of the Republic. Conservatives associated democracy with surrender. Communists viewed it as a temporary stage before revolution. Nationalists accused civilian politicians of betraying an army they claimed had remained undefeated in the field. That false claim became known as the stab in the back myth. It argued that Germany had not truly lost the war, but had been destroyed from within by politicians, socialists, and Jews. The story was fictional, but politically devastating. Violence became a regular feature of public life. Armed groups fought in the streets. Political assassinations targeted officials. Both the radical left and radical right attempted to overthrow the government, while ordinary citizens watched institutions repeatedly fail to deliver stability. Then came the hyperinflation crisis of 1923. Savings accumulated over entire lifetimes became nearly worthless. Wages lost value before workers could spend them. Families sold possessions for food, while confidence in the state collapsed along with the currency. The Republic survived, and the middle years of the decade brought partial recovery. Foreign loans returned, industry expanded, and political violence declined. But the stability was fragile because it depended heavily on international credit and cooperation. Britain and France repeatedly surrendered strategic ground to avoid another devastating conflict. Meanwhile, Stalin was considering an agreement with the same Nazi regime that openly viewed Soviet communism as an enemy marked for destruction. Beneath the surface, powerful groups still distrusted democracy. Military leaders, industrialists, landowners, and conservative politicians believed parliamentary government was weak. Many feared communism more than they feared the radical nationalist movement growing on the right. That calculation would become catastrophic. Some elites believed Hitler could attract mass support, destroy the left, and then be controlled by experienced conservatives. They saw him as a useful instrument rather than a future dictator. Hitler, meanwhile, had learned from his failed coup in 1923. Instead of attacking the system from outside, he would use elections, propaganda, legal appointments, and political deals to enter the government through its own doors. Even then, his rise was not guaranteed. The Nazi Party remained limited while the economy improved. What transformed it from a radical movement into a national force was not Versailles alone, but a financial disaster that began far beyond Germany. The fragile recovery of the Weimar Republic depended heavily on American loans. German banks, businesses, and local governments borrowed from abroad, while reparation payments continued to connect Germany's economy to the larger financial system created after the First World War. When the American stock market collapsed in 1929, that system began to seize up. United States lenders pulled money back from Europe. Credit disappeared, German banks came under pressure, businesses failed, and unemployment rose with terrifying speed. By 1932, roughly 6 million Germans were unemployed. Millions more faced reduced wages, shortened hours, lost savings, or the constant fear that they would be next. Economic insecurity became a daily experience rather than an abstract statistic. The Democratic Party struggled to respond. Coalition governments fractured over taxes, unemployment benefits, and spending cuts. Parliament became increasingly divided, while presidents and chancellors relied more heavily on emergency decrees instead of ordinary democratic compromise. This political paralysis benefited the most extreme parties. Communists promised revolution. The Nazis promised national revival, employment, military strength, social order, and revenge against the groups they falsely blamed for Germany's suffering. Nazi propaganda was deliberately flexible. To industrialists, Hitler presented himself as a barrier against communism. To workers, he promised jobs. To the middle class, he promised stability. To nationalists, he promised to destroy Versailles and restore German power. Now imagine standing in Europe in 1938. Hitler demands another piece of a neighboring country. Giving it to him might preserve peace. Refusing him could trigger a war that kills millions. There is no safe choice, only competing dangers. The Great Depression did not create Hitler's ideology. His hatred of democracy, anti-Semitism, racial theories, and territorial ambitions had developed long before the crisis. What the Depression destroyed were the political and economic barriers that had kept his movement from power. Nazi electoral support rose dramatically, but Hitler never won an outright majority in a free national election. He gained power through a combination of mass support, political deadlock, elite calculation, intimidation, and a constitutional appointment. In January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler chancellor. Conservative politicians believed they could surround him with experienced officials, use his popularity, weaken the left, and control his actions from inside the government. They had made one of the most disastrous political calculations in modern history. Within months, Hitler began destroying the institutions that had brought him to power. The economic crisis had opened the door, but Germany's traditional elites had chosen to let him walk through it. Once in power, Hitler moved far beyond the goal of revising the Treaty of Versailles. He did not simply want Germany treated as an equal nation again. He wanted to rebuild Europe through conquest, racial domination, and permanent war. Some of his early promises appealed to ordinary nationalist grievances. He vowed to restore military strength, recover lost territory, end foreign restrictions, and reunite German-speaking populations under one state. Those goals helped him appear reasonable to people who opposed Versailles, but did not yet understand the full scale of his ambitions. Foreign leaders often made the same mistake. They treated each demand as a limited correction rather than part of a larger expansionist program. Hitler's deeper objectives had been visible for years. He believed Germany needed living space in Eastern Europe. He viewed the Soviet Union as both an ideological enemy and a vast territory to be conquered, colonized, and exploited. His vision was also fundamentally racial. Jews were portrayed as enemies within Germany and across Europe. Slavic populations were considered inferior. War was not merely a tool of foreign policy. It was central to the kind of empire Hitler intended to build. Germany withdrew from international restrictions, expanded military spending, restored conscription, and developed forces explicitly forbidden after the First World War. Each violation tested whether Britain, France, or the League of Nations would impose a serious cost. Comment fight if you would confront Hitler immediately. Comment wait if you would negotiate and buy more time. By the end of the story, one choice will look far more dangerous than it appears right now. In March 1936, German troops entered the Rhineland, which had been demilitarized under the post-war settlement. The German military was still relatively weak, and Hitler knew a determined French response could have forced a retreat. No such response came. Britain viewed the move as Germany entering its own territory. France was unwilling to act alone. Hitler had taken a major risk and discovered that his opponents were divided, cautious, and deeply afraid of escalation. 2 years later, Germany annexed Austria. The union was celebrated by many Austrians, but it also violated the existing European order and brought millions of people, major resources, and strategic territory under Nazi control. Hitler then turned toward Czechoslovakia, claiming he only wanted to protect ethnic Germans living in the Sudetenland, but his plans went far beyond self-determination. He intended to destroy the Czechoslovak state and absorb its industrial and military strength. This distinction matters. Versailles gave Hitler a language of grievance, but it did not create his racial worldview or his desire for conquest. He used legitimate complaints as a bridge toward objectives that were far more radical. By the late 1930s, the pattern was clear. Every successful violation strengthened Germany, weakened its neighbors, and convinced Hitler that the democracies would continue retreating. But Europe was not the only region where aggression was being rewarded. Long before German forces crossed into Poland, another war was already transforming Asia. In September 1931, Japanese officers used an explosion near a railway in Manchuria as a pretext to launch a full military occupation. Within months, Japan controlled the region and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. The League of Nations investigated the crisis and refused to recognize the conquest, but it had no effective military power and little willingness to impose serious consequences. Japan responded by leaving the League of Nations in 1933. The message was impossible to miss. A major power could seize territory, reject international criticism, and simply walk away from the institution created to preserve peace. The crisis also exposed a deeper weakness in collective security. Britain and France were focused on Europe. The United States remained outside the League, and few governments were willing to risk war or major economic disruption over distant territory in China. To understand why, we cannot begin with the invasion of Poland. We must return to 1919, when the victorious powers gathered to build a permanent peace and instead created a system filled with resentment, weakness, and unresolved conflict. Japanese expansion continued. In July 1937, fighting near Beijing escalated into full-scale war between Japan and China. Major cities were attacked, civilians were displaced, and the conflict spread across one of the largest countries in the world. This means the usual date of September 1939 tells only the European side of the story. For millions of people in China, the violence that would become part of World War II had already begun years earlier. Historians still debate the best starting point. Some emphasize 1931 and the occupation of Manchuria. Others point to 1937 and the beginning of full-scale war in China. Many still use 1939 for the war in Europe. The debate matters because dates shape memory. If the story begins only in Poland, Japanese aggression appears separate from the collapse of the international order. In reality, the crises in Asia and Europe revealed the same dangerous pattern. Aggressive states tested the rules, encountered weak resistance, and learned that expansion could succeed. Each failure encouraged the next challenge, while the governments defending the existing order became more cautious, divided, and uncertain. By the late 1930s, war had not erupted from a single center. It was spreading through multiple regions because the system designed to stop aggression had repeatedly proven unable to enforce its own principles. The League of Nations had been created to prevent another global war. Its central promise was collective security. If one nation attacked another, the members were supposed to respond together, making aggression too costly to succeed. In theory, the system was powerful. In practice, it depended entirely on whether governments were willing to enforce it. The League had no permanent army, no independent source of power, and no reliable way to compel its strongest members to act. The United States never joined. Britain and France remained the dominant members, but both were burdened by economic weakness, imperial commitments, and the memory of the First World War. They supported international cooperation, but not always at the price of another major conflict. The first serious tests exposed the problem. Japan occupied Manchuria. Italy invaded Ethiopia. Germany rebuilt its armed forces and sent troops into the Rhineland. Each act violated the existing order, yet each produced hesitation, delay, and incomplete punishment. The familiar story is simple. Hitler rose to power, rebuilt Germany's military, seized neighboring territory, invaded Poland, and forced Britain and France into war. Every step in that sequence happened, but the sequence alone explains very little. Economic sanctions were often limited because governments feared damaging their own trade. Military action was considered too dangerous. Diplomatic condemnation sounded impressive, but aggressive states quickly learned that words without enforcement carried little weight. The invasion of Ethiopia was especially damaging. Italy used modern weapons against a League member, while Britain and France avoided measures strong enough to stop Mussolini. They feared pushing Italy closer to Hitler and disrupting their own strategic interests. That calculation failed. Italy completed the conquest and later aligned more closely with Germany. The League had sacrificed its principles in the hope of preserving stability, only to weaken both the institution and the balance of power. Germany drew the same lesson from the Rhineland crisis. Hitler had taken a major gamble, but Britain and France did not intervene. The success strengthened his position at home and encouraged the belief that his opponents would retreat again. Collective security did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It eroded through repeated decisions to avoid immediate risk. Each compromise made the next violation easier, while every failure reduced the credibility of future warnings. The lesson was brutal. International rules are only as strong as the willingness of nations to defend them. But Britain and France were not simply careless. They were haunted by the last war, and that fear shaped the policy that came next. Appeasement is often remembered as simple cowardice, but that judgment ignores the pressure facing Britain and France. Their leaders were not deciding between a good option and a bad one. They were choosing among several dangerous possibilities, all shaped by the trauma of the previous war. The First World War had killed millions, shattered economies, and left entire societies terrified of repeating the experience. Public opinion strongly favored peace, military budgets had been reduced, and many voters believed diplomacy was more responsible than another rush toward conflict. Britain also faced commitments across a global empire, while France depended on political unity that was increasingly fragile. Neither country felt fully prepared for a major continental war, especially if Italy, Japan, or the Soviet Union became involved in unpredictable ways. Many British leaders also believed some German complaints were legitimate. They saw the restrictions imposed after 1919 as too rigid and assumed that limited revisions might satisfy Hitler without destroying the wider European order. It does not explain why Europe's strongest democracies allowed Germany to grow more dangerous for years. It does not explain why millions of Germans abandoned moderate parties, or why so many conservative leaders believed they could use Hitler without being consumed by him. This was the central logic of appeasement: concede demands that appeared reasonable, avoid immediate war, and gain time for negotiation and military preparation. At several points, the strategy looked practical rather than reckless. The problem was that Hitler did not treat compromise as a final settlement. He treated it as evidence that pressure worked. Each concession improved Germany's strategic position, weakened neighboring states, and encouraged him to demand more. Appeasement also damaged trust. Smaller countries began to suspect that Britain and France might sacrifice them to preserve their own security. Potential allies questioned whether promises of protection would survive the next crisis. Still, condemning every effort at negotiation is too easy. Diplomacy can prevent war when both sides accept limits. Appeasement fails when one side views every agreement as a temporary pause before the next expansion. By 1938, Britain and France believed they were buying time. Hitler believed they were proving their weakness. Those two interpretations collided over Czechoslovakia, where peace would be preserved by giving away territory that belonged to someone else. By 1938, Czechoslovakia had become the next major test of Europe's will. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a heavily fortified border region with a large German-speaking population and some of the country's most important industrial facilities. Czechoslovakia was not a helpless state. It possessed a capable army, modern defenses, and alliances with France and the Soviet Union. But its survival depended on whether those allies were willing to risk war before Germany became even stronger. Hitler claimed he was defending ethnic Germans who had been mistreated by the Czech government. Some grievances existed, but Nazi propaganda exaggerated them and transformed a political dispute into justification for dismantling an independent country. Britain and France feared that refusing Hitler's demands would trigger a general war. Their leaders met with Germany and Italy in Munich, hoping that surrendering the Sudetenland would satisfy Hitler and preserve peace. Czechoslovakia was not allowed to negotiate as an equal participant in the decision over its own territory. Its leaders were pressured to accept an agreement made by stronger powers because resistance without British or French support appeared almost impossible.